Hello, Brian McKenzie from Maynooth University Critical Skills. This lecture is about the concept of information has value. This is one of the frames from the Framework for Information Literacy from the Association of College and Research Libraries. So this lecture, today we're going to talk about this concept of knowledge is power. We're going to talk about big data, the cost of knowledge and the digital divide, and then valuing information from plagiarism to sundoku. And depending on how much I talk about Napoleon, you have 35 to 40 minutes to Google sundoku. Now, what I'd hope that you take away from this lecture is a really good understanding of the frame. This particular frame, information has value, and I hope that you are able to articulate this concept and see it on many different levels, from as basic a level as referencing citations, all the way up to challenging ideas. I mean, about intellectual property, copyright, commodification of data, things like that. And again, I'd hope you'll be able to sort of connect that in practice. So all the different sort of examples of this frame, information has value. I mean, if you can take away from this lecture the ability to see this concept in action in lots of different ways and levels, then it'd be a success. Let's look at the actual text from the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education to start out with. Okay, so it says information possesses several dimensions of value, including as a commodity, as a means of education, as a means to influence, and as a means of negotiating and understanding the world. Legal and socioeconomic interests influence information production and dissemination. That's a lot to unpack there. And we'll go through some examples that illustrate this. The dispositions of this particular frame are interesting in that there's 4 bullet points here. Respect the original ideas of others, value the skills, time, and effort needed to produce knowledge. And that's a really important thing about the information has value, because it's not just a monetary value necessarily, right? It's there's lots of different ways that people value information. There's lots of different ways for you to value or show you value information. Are inclined to, see themselves as contributors to the information marketplace rather than consumers of it. So to stay with the whole metaphors of information has value, your job as a university student is no longer just to bank information, okay, and then make a withdrawal when your exam comes. At university, you should be contributing to the scholarly conversation, to reference one of our other frames, okay? And you're inclined to examine your own information privilege, okay? We'll talk a lot more about that. So in terms of the practices, give credit to the original ideas of others through proper attribution and citation. So yeah, on a very basic level, just as with scholarship as conversation, one of the ways to show that you value information or that information has value is to properly cite it. And that relates to the intellectual property and lots of other things. We'll talk a little bit about, we'll basically tag most of these in this lecture, so kind of keep the frames document sort of handy as we go through the lecture and look at where you see kind of knowledge practices or dispositions. Okay. Well, let's start with Francis Bacon. And you're probably all familiar with the saying "knowledge is power," which was attributed to him. He may not have said it exactly that way. Don't confuse, by the way, another Francis Bacon, who's a famous Irish-born painter of the 20th century, and controversially, his studio was moved from England to Dublin, and it's actually, I highly recommend it if you're ever in Dublin, go and visit the painter Francis Bacon's studio. But this is the sort of other Francis Bacon, who was the Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England. Now, Francis Bacon said knowledge is power, and it's kind of, interesting in a couple ways coming from Francis Bacon, because Francis Bacon, as Attorney General, had a license to torture and actually advocated the use of torture to protect the state. And so when Francis Bacon says knowledge is power, is not like, innocuous, right? Francis Bacon is talking in very real and bloody terms that knowledge is power. Okay. There's another way that we can kind of see knowledge as power in this term, or the value of information, and that's in reference to what's called capital, right? Capital, for most of you would understand capital, you would say, that's money. But there's another concept that's about cultural capital and social capital. And a lot of this work comes from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote a book, Distinction, and it's 1979, I think, and it's translated into English as Distinction. I think a critique of social judgment. So the Bourdieu talks about cultural and social capital, and what this means is that possessing information is a way of distinguishing social class, and that being able to talk about art, being able to talk about classical music, there's all the ways that information is used to set yourself apart in terms of your social class, whereas the inability to have this capital, this social cultural capital, is an indicator of a lower social status. And there's great tons and tons of research that come from Bourdieu. And for example, I just grabbed this study. This is one about literacy and numeracy, that basically if you possess numeracy skills, it increases your social capital in terms of your ability to go off and get jobs and obtain higher place positions and things like that. So information has value in very, very concrete terms and in sort of long-term ways. Now, transitioning to an interesting kind of parallel here is with the commodification of people's personal data, the information about you. So this is called big data. You've probably heard the term. And it's the collection of all of the sort of electronic browsing data, spending data that companies have about you. And this is anything from cookies tracking your browsing history to your grocery store whatever it is, loyalty club thing that you scan every time you grocery shop, and then that the grocery store then has years and years of data about what you buy. Oh, Friday, looking for, Mackenzie, he should be coming in and getting some of that Coors Light or whatever. So big data has loads and loads of information about you personally. Think about it. For example, if you have like well, let me see, we have your little a train card that you might use in your tapping. Okay, you're creating data. If you have a swipe card that you use to get into buildings, you're creating data that potentially is tracked. So there's an interesting study from Robert Shapiro and Siddhartha Aneje here, and it's from March 2019. To give you the reference here, and what they've done is, so they've sort of estimated the personal value of an individual, and though they kind of did, it's an interesting study, and they've sort of looked at all of the profits from advertising of the likes of Google and everything like that, and they've also looked at the profits and revenue from the companies who sell on your personal information. So again, for example, if you're using a credit card, or you're buying stuff with some sort of electronic payment type thing, you're again creating a constant trail of data, right? And so MasterCard and American Express, two credit companies, so they're selling the personal information to other people. So again, for example, they could say, oh, Mackenzie, for the last 5 years at Christmas time, here's what he's spending on his MasterCard, or every summer vacation time, here's what Mackenzie's credit card looks like. So my spending habits are then turned into data that can be sold to other companies who can then flog stuff at me. So they looked at all of the sort of revenues for advertising, and they looked at all of the revenues of people who sell on personal information, and they conclude, if this is, I quoted directly from their conclusion, if we agree with most Americans that each of us owns his or her own personal information, then Americans should receive a substantial share of those revenues. Because the argument is, of course, they're making money off of you and your information, where you travel, when you travel, what you buy, through direct payments or to fund broad public purposes. With a 50-50 division of earnings derived in just these four areas from people's personal information, every American who uses the internet should receive $183 in 2020, $308 in 2022. Alternatively, a 50-50 split could be used to fund infrastructure, advance universal health care coverage, cut payroll taxes, or substantially reduce the budget deficit. So you have, commodified information out there, personal information about you, all of your, well, I mean, and it's substantial. It's a huge amount. Depending on what social media platform you use, there could be more or less. In Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulation since I think this year, basically, since 2019 or late 2018. And this is interesting in that it gives individuals the right to request all of the personal data that these companies have about you. So you can write to Google, and you can write to Facebook and other companies and say, what data do you have? And the GDPR website, this is the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland. They have instructions on how you can do this, and they say basically it should be free to request this data, and there's some instructions there. I'll throw a link up to it. But yeah, you can now sort of request this. How much data do these companies have about you? What do they actually know about you? So it could be an interesting exercise. All right. Let's talk then about other ways of pricing or valuating information. And we'll transition here to part of the idea of information privilege as a university student, or as a student at a Maynooth, or a faculty at staff at Maynooth, or at any university. So the university library has a subscription to a number of databases for access to books and journals, the top-end peer-reviewed books and journals. One of the biggest publishers is the Dutch company Elsevier. And so I went to the Elsevier website, and I pulled their subscription price list from 2020, and it's a little bit grainy and smaller, and I've only screenshotted the first page with the A's here. But basically, for a year subscription to the journal, the Abstract Bulletin of Paper Science and Technology, it's €3,780. If you want to subscribe to Accounting, Organization and Society, it's €3,329 for the year. These are individual journal subscriptions for a year. Okay, so you can imagine how much libraries and universities end up spending on journal subscriptions every year. It's a immense amount of money, and huge outlay. MIT published, Massachusetts Institute of Technology publishes their information, and I think they said last year they spent $2.7 million on Elsevier journals. Just Elsevier alone, $2.7 million from MIT. So this is, if you want to access the cutting edge current research from these journals, this is the subscription prices you're going to be paying. Now, in the Scholarship as Conversation and Searching as Exploration videos, lectures, I don't go into too much detail about the databases at Maynooth, but this is something that you should definitely find time to explore, because the main search engine for the Maynooth University Library is this federated search engine. So it looks like a Google search box, and it combines, or any search term you put in there, it basically searches everything. But all of the results kind of come out together, and so we know that students tend not to kind of browse much further down than the first page or so, or first screen or so of results. So you're getting the results from all of the sources that the library has access to through this window, this federated search engine. But behind there are all of these databases, okay? And so if you want to do a much more focused search, you would actually use the databases to sort of zero in on a topic. And so there's 13 databases found for L, from l'année philologique and on down. Now the library has subject guides, LibGuides, subject guides, and I'd recommend you look at those for your own subjects for your different classes, because they're very interesting. They gives you the top recommended journals, and you can search those individually, but it also gives you the top databases for business. So in the Searching and Strategic Exploration lecture, we did a kind of a short example of a search, and it was for a modest research assignment, and where we didn't actually need to go into specific databases. But as your academic work becomes more advanced, and you really need to sort of focus in on disciplinary research, you should start to use the actual databases that are popular in your various disciplines. So for example, the Lexis Library for Law, if you go into that database and you could actually search by case name, or you can actually even search by if you have the citation for the, such and such a Supreme Court decision or whatever it is. So again, if you did this search in the main search window of the university library, the results that you would get from here are going to be there somewhere, but they could be 100,000 hits down or further. Whereas if you know that you can go, you're doing law research, you can go straight to the Lexis Library, or another popular one would be for Irish law, Westlaw. You could go in and start to do work on there. History, we love JSTOR, for example, as our kind of go-to database. So these databases are great, absolutely fantastic. They're also extremely expensive. Extremely expensive. So your access to these databases is the kind of foremost example of information privilege. I mean, arguably your access to the internet is also, well, we can touch on that.